Hi, Indira. It's so good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
It's just wonderful to have you here. I always feel so privileged to get to talk to you, to have known you for about eight years. No, not that many. 7 or 8 years, 6 years,
Yeah,
7 years.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
been a while. Yeah.
I'm really grateful for your guidance through so much of what I've been working on and really an inspiration to so much of what I do now. So I just want to acknowledge that as we get started.
Yeah.
It's a real honor to introduce you in person to the community, to everyone who's watching this. Um, and I'd just like to introduce you actually to go through some of your leadership so that people know who you are. So it's Dr. Indira Henard, and she's been with the DC Rape Crisis Center for the last 14 years in different types of leadership. She's now the executive director, and she has been for quite some time. Now, the DC Rape Crisis Center is different than most other rape crisis centers you might know. It's actually the oldest one in the US, celebrating 50 years of survivor-centered community-led services this year. So this is really a momentous occasion. And when we think about rape crisis and that it's kind of only been around for 50 years in an official capacity, this is really a tremendous area of leadership now and moving into the future. So the DC Rape Crisis Center is phenomenal. They received the 2019 and 2020 Best Places to Work by the Washington Business Journal, and 2019, 2020, and 2021 Best of Washington Award, including the Business Hall of Fame, as well as the 2019 Agency of the Year Award by the National Association of Social Workers. I just want to point out a lot of that time is during the pandemic when demand for services totally skyrocketed and we saw a massive upsurge in domestic violence and sexual assault. So this is a tremendous amount of leadership to be working in challenging conditions with limited funding during that
Mhm.
time. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that as we get started. There's more to know about Dr. Henard. She coordinated several public policy initiatives in organizing and planning spaces for survivor-led advocacy, has provided high-level training and technical assistance to local nonprofits and international NGOs. She partnered to open the first rape crisis center in Lagos in Nigeria. Amazing. I would love to hear more about that. And also, I know her because she was very gracious enough to partner with us working on the Rape Crisis Counseling app with a coalition of international NGOs. We created a mobile app to support refugee workers working with sexual assault victims to support a network of survivors who don't have access to rape crisis centers all over the world. And that's in more than 30 countries now. So you hear me talk about that a lot. But she was the original one that was like, I believe in you. You can do this. Let's do this together. And I will be forever grateful for that. Recently, Dr. Henard has been selected to serve on the Independent Review Commission to address sexual assault in the military under the Office of the Secretary of Defense as ordered by President Biden. And she was also awarded the 2020 Washingtonian of the Year Award, as well as the 2021 Women Who Mean Business Award presented by the Washington Business Journal. So that is Dr. Indira Henard. I'm going to call you Indira from here on, but I think everyone can get a sense of just who you are and just how lucky we are to be sitting with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So great to be with you again. And I'm excited to talk to you all.
We're really excited to learn from you. Is there any story that you'd like us to know as we get started talking about change making? You know, we talk a lot about well-being, about self-care, caring
Mhm.
for the carers in a way, about why you got started working in rape crisis. Like, what is your why for this work?
Yeah, I think my why is layered, right? So people ask me all the time, why rape crisis? How can you do that work? Oh my God, so right, heavy. But what I like to say is that this is not hard work, this is heart work, right? And I feel like rape crisis work, it found me, right? And so when people ask me, what is your why? My response is, well, why not? Right. And so I think for me, what has become abundantly clear is that what gets me excited, what wakes me up in the morning, even though I may be a little tired, is to be able to see the healing that happens before my eyes when we are working with a survivor of sexual violence. This truly is my life's work. It is the highest honor and such a gift for me to be leading the oldest rape crisis center in the midst of a global pandemic. and a racial reckoning. And we are 50 years old. And so I think for me, sexual violence is um, such a human rights violation on just the fundamental level of what it means to be just a human being, right? It gets at your soul. And so the work that we do, it's soul work, it's sacred work, it's unscripted work. And so there is nothing more powerful for me than being able to be in service to survivors. Because what we fail to realize is that when someone is sexually violated, it doesn't just impact the individual, it impacts the community, it impacts the family. And so really, we're looking at the individual from a family standpoint, but also from a holistic standpoint.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about what that means, that holistic standpoint, because it's so unusual and it stood out from the first time I spoke with you.
Yeah, so I think, we are very clear that yes, we believe in traditional psychodynamic modalities, right, in terms of therapeutic services. But what we also know for survivors is that there is no straight path to healing. And so we create multiple choice gates for survivors. And so what I like to say is that we offer a healing buffet, right? And so you can come in for individual therapy and or group counseling, but what we also offer is alternative holistic methods as well. So we believe in Reiki and we believe in cranial sacrity, and I lead sweat lodges for our clients, which is a Native American tradition that's rooted in the Lakota tradition, and it's almost like a rebirthing purification experience. And I take about 25 to 30 survivors, my team and I, out to Gore, Virginia, and we built the structure of a sweat lodge, which is a dome-like structure, and it's very pitch black inside, and it's 124 degrees, very hot. It's also very ritualistic. And so we do that, and we do 4 rounds of that. And each round is an hour in that 124-degree temperature. So I normally serve as the pourer, and that's the person who leads inside of the lounge. And, depending on what's in my heart, I may lead rounds on shame and forgiveness, or, kind of whatever is kind of coming to me, whatever the universe is saying, or I may be the firekeeper, right? But the point is that it is a release, and it's another way to move the trauma through your body, and to really get to a place where it's reconciled, so that you can continue unpacking in a really healthy way.
That's phenomenal work. And I love what you said about the trauma in the body. So much of old kind of paradigm trauma healing is talk therapy and just talk about it and it'll feel better. And of course, it doesn't work like that. So to include the body, it's
Yep,
true, like pioneering in that way.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about how the pandemic and also the racial reckoning is impacting your community and the communities that you serve. We know that sexual violence affects Black communities more, actually. So I'd love to
Mhm.
hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a wild 3 years, right? There was no playbook or blueprint for how to lead, how to run an agency in the midst of a pandemic. And so, for the first time in 50 years, we had to pivot, and we had to pivot quickly. And so, all of our services went virtually via telehealth. And my team did a beautiful job of that seamless transition. But what we also found out is that we had to do some stuff on the front end in order to prepare, right? So everybody went virtual. Everybody was just like we are on their laptops on Zoom, but we had to do a survey of our clients to see what supplies would be needed so that there wouldn't be a disruption in their therapeutic services, right? So, for example, having a laptop and a computer, it's a luxury. Everybody doesn't have that. Everybody doesn't have Wi-Fi. It's a luxury. Some folks, were struggling to keep the lights on, right? So we really had to do a survey to see what was needed. So we bought laptops and iPads, and I even paid for some Wi-Fi bills, right? To really make sure all of our clients were able to still be served. But then we also had to do some education one-on-one on just technology, right? So we had to kind of bridge that intergenerational divide and make sure that some of our elder clients who was not that familiar with the platforms, that they would be able to log on and do what they needed to do. So it really showed us that anything is possible in terms of being creative with services, but that there could have been a lot of systemic barriers and pressure and oppression as it relates to folks continuing to get access. I think the other piece, as you know, during the pandemic, is that we also have this racial reckoning, and we saw the continued killings of Black folks by law enforcement, right? We saw George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, et cetera, et cetera. And so the majority of our clients do come from low economic backgrounds, wards 5, 7, and 8 in DC. And the majority of our clients are Black African American. And so we had to be very intentional around what the racial reckoning meant, not only for our Black clients, but also for our Black staff, for myself as Black leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we know at the DC Rape Crisis Center and what we are founded on is a legacy of Black leadership, right? Our mission is that, we create a world free of sexual violence, but we also know that all forms of oppression are connected, and that you cannot look at sexual violence as a single issue, because we don't live single issue lives. And so the programming, the work that we do, we are very clear that in order to have effective sexual assault services, there must be a direct response to racism and oppression. And so we were able to really be intentional with our clients and our Black clients, with our staff. We are always a staff that's having the hard conversations and creating space, or what I like to call creating a brave space for folks to really talk about how what is happening in the world is impacting them, right? Because what we also have to realize is, in the midst of what I call the COVID trauma, right? We have the political trauma, and then we have the racial trauma, right? And so when we look at it from a survivor standpoint, particularly our Black survivors, it was literally compounded trauma, right? It was a triple threat. It was almost like a perfect storm. And then as it relates to the racial reckoning, when you tie that to the historical trauma, right, that Black folks have experienced, it was a lot, right? It was a lot even for me as a Black leader, right? What does it mean for me to show up as every day as a Black woman who is leading the oldest rape crisis center in a predominantly white space, right? Making sure I had time to process, making sure I had support, and that I was taking care of this vessel, meaning the nervous system, as much as possible.
Self-care is such an important part of it. And if one of the things that I've learned in the last few years, like as on the periphery and doing some of my own work around the racial reckoning, is how much of racial oppression has a sexual violence component to it. Mm-hmm. And I think I just want to recognize that here in that space. This might be something that definitely people who are listening, some of them might know about this, but definitely also people who are white in the community may not have thought about that before, and how sexual violence is used as a tool of racial oppression. So we can get into it or not, but I just want to bookmark that and really be clear about those two things going very much together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we really can't talk about race. We can't talk about sexual violence as it relates to Black and Brown communities without really looking at it from a historical context, right? So what we know in the US is that during slavery, Black slaves were used, Black female slaves, and even Black males, but we're talking about Black female slaves, were used to build white wealth in this country, right? To broaden the political economy in this country. And so there was forced breeding, there was forced sterilization, right? You can't talk about sexual violence without talking about reproductive justice. The current gynecological procedures that we go through today as women, for example, the pap smear, that was originated on Black slave females, right, by white men. And so, it's important that we make these linkages, right? And so when we look at how Black slaves were treated during slavery, how their masters forced themselves on them, they had babies, all of that without consent. And then we look at the reproductive justice aspect of it, right? And then we fast forward to even what's happening now, right, in our country with maternal mortality in Black women and reproductive justice. And then we see, for example, Breonna Taylor, who got killed. All of this state-sanctioned violence, reproductive justice, sexual violence, is all connected. And that's why we are so clear that you have to look at everything from an anti-oppression lens, from an intersectional lens. And so, our work, and definitely my kind of personal work in this world, really meets at the intersection of freedom and justice and liberation, because we have to be able to understand the history so that we can really put what's happening in today's world in context.
Yeah, and thank you for providing some of that context for us. I know it's going to be new to many people listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very. So when we talk about self-care from that standpoint, it's really the reason that I started to get into this work was thinking, okay, survivors who I was at the time working mostly with change makers, those of us who aren't supported end up like our work suffers, our life suffers, our relationship suffers. So if we can fix, and as you said, this heart work, this one issue, fix, not the best word, but if we can resolve the way that the trauma is held, the way that the person feels in their body, give them access to themselves again, it's as if we get to reposition them back into the world as, or they position themselves back into the world as thriving leaders, fully capable of being able to have the kind of lives that they want, make the kind of impact that they want. So I see this especially as so valuable, this work for all of us, but especially those of us who have experienced this trauma. Self-care is like absolutely essential to make sure that we're even able to like get out of bed in the morning and do this work. And even more so when someone is experiencing multiple oppressions and police violence and it starts to get really layered, especially with the disparity in health services. It's a lot, it's, as you said, it's a lot of layers. What
Absolutely.
is, please.
No, I was just going to say one thing in terms of I'm actually starting to really push back a little and have some resistance towards the term self-care, because self-care, when most folks think of self-care, they think of walks and bubble baths and all that. That's not what self-care is. The term that I'm really starting to embrace is community care, right? Because when we think about the work that we do, when we think about what it takes to sustain the work that we do, what it takes to sustain us in order to do the work. People ask me, how long have I been doing sexual violence work? And I say, I've been in the game over 20 years, right? I'm a oldie but goodie. And they say, well, how are you in this work for so long? Because what we see in the movement, in the sexual violence movement, is that it is a revolving door. Folks are in and out, right? Particularly Black women leaders in the movement, right? It's not that many of us because of burnout, and the work looks differently for Black women leaders, right? The standard is different for Black women leaders. And so for me, the reason that I have sustained so long is not because I practice self-care. No, it is because I have developed what I call community care. Right. And community care for me, and yes, I need to be mindful of my wellness. And so I use the term wellness because it's a holistic effort for me. But it's, for me, my sustainment is community care. And the question I pose to people: whom or what do you go to in the midnight hour, right? When the days are long, when the midnights are hard, when the sun has not come up in the morning, right? Who is your tribe? Who is your personal board of directors? And so that is just, for me, the circle that I have been able to cultivate has been such a has been such a joy for me. And it's been so I can't even begin to describe what it has meant, because there's no way that I would be here today had it not been for that community of care, the community of practice. And so I encourage folks who are in this work to think about who is in your circle, right? Who are the people that you can completely be vulnerable with, where you can completely take off the mask, right? Because nobody does it alone. And this work, it is rewarding, but it can be challenging sometimes. And even more so when you come to this work as a survivor, right? And so there's an extra, what I call, responsibility that you have when you come to this work as a survivor, which most folks in the movement do. There's some type of personal connection, and you are in a position of leadership. There's an extra level of accountability and responsibility that you have for your vessel, right? So that's why I'm really trying to, so for me, self-care is like a setup for me, because I don't do bubble baths and I'm not that good at walking, which I'm trying to be better at, right? And so for me, it's about my community.
Yes. And what we know too, I mean, there's so much science behind this where individual health is kind of non-existent. Health exists in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The strength
Mm-hmm.
of our mental health, the strength of our emotional health depends upon the quality of our relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the
Yep.
things I've noticed with sexual violence in particular. The
Mm-hmm.
way that it impacts relationships is
Yep.
so pernicious in that way,
Yep.
because it creates that distortion in how we see ourselves, how we think
Mm-hmm.
others see us, and how others see us, that makes relating harder to do. So I think it just takes like extra
Mm-hmm.
extra work and courage. But I love that reframe, because it's very true. It's away from this individualistic frame of,
Mm-hmm.
and much towards something that's much more real and connected, and relationship acknowledging and honoring.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
I think it
Absolutely.
resonate deeply with a lot of people listening.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest challenges that you've had in educating people about how to support survivors?
I think the biggest challenge is language, right? That there's still a lot of educating that we have to do around what is sexual violence, what constitutes sexual violence, how are people defining it. I think the other piece is that we have to really bridge that intergenerational divide, right? Because when I talk to a 70, 80-year-old about sexual assault, sexual violence, the conversation is much different if I'm talking to a 20, 30, or 40-year-old, right? And that is literally based off of, views and experiences and things like that, right? So when we saw these high-profile sexual assault cases in the news, there was a lot of division. For example, Bill Cosby. The Black community is so divided over Bill Cosby, right? And a lot of it is division down the middle by age, right? Because some of, the elder folks in the Black community are like, what are you talking about? Like, she said, he did this and that. Like, I'm not seeing that. Like, there was no rape, right? So again, understanding what constitutes sexual violence on the gender-based violence continuum is so important. And so I think a lot of the work in sexual violence continues to be around language, continues to be around level setting. What is sexual assault one-on-one? Continues to be around disrupting this rape culture, right? And it continues to, be around that folks need to understand it can happen to anyone, right? At any age, men, women, sexual orientation, race, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's also really important to know. So, our work is not done. And I think, part of what we have been trying to do and continue to do is to have the conversation, right? Is to have the conversation in the spaces that folks aren't having the conversation. So our faith-based institutions are critical. We're starting to see some progress in our militaries, et cetera, right? So again, it's all rooted in language.
The conversations are sometimes the hardest part. I remember even in my own process, to come back to the idea of definitions too, when we were working on the app and even a little bit after, I looked at those definitions and I was like, oh no, because what it forced me to have a reckoning about what I thought had happened and what actually had happened according to these definitions. And the
Yeah.
history started to look very different. And it's been a journey around that, as some of I've shared with you, and you were so gracious to
Yes.
support me in my path in that way. But the reckoning is real, and there are real barriers to wanting to acknowledge, hey, this has happened to me and it's not okay. It wasn't okay then, and it's not okay now.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Having these conversations is key and so important to be able to speak about things that seemed like secrets. There's so much discrimination
Mm-hmm.
amongst different cultural communities, especially amongst different ages.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things that you would encourage people to think about if they're considering disclosing or they're supporting someone else's disclosure?
Yeah, so I think if you're supporting someone else's disclosure, I think one of the most important things you can do is listen, right? This is not the time to ask a million questions, et cetera, et cetera. You don't get to dissect someone's story, right? And to that end, no one owes you their story, right? If someone comes to you and says that they have been sexually violated, the hope is that you would believe them, right? That you would listen to them, that you would, let them know that you are there to support them in whatever they want to do or don't want to do. It's so critical. And, I say again, that goes back to just level setting, because when someone is sexually violated, particularly in those early stages, they may not know what they want to do. They may not know what they need, right? So sometimes it's just about having presence. It's just about saying those simple words of, I believe you, I'm here for you, I'm here to listen, et cetera, et cetera. Those words can mean so much. And then what I would say, for those who are disclosing, right? It takes so much courage to tell your story or to tell someone that you have been sexually violated. My fervent hope is that folks know the resources out there, whether it's calling a crisis hotline or coming in for support. But what I will also say is that your path is your path, right? And that your healing is going to look different. And so you may not want therapeutic professional support. You may not want to do anything. And so I encourage, I encourage folks who disclose to really just see how they're feeling and what direction they want to go, right? And I think it's so important for those who are disclosing that they don't feel like they're being rushed. Right. And so what I tell folks all the time who's on the receiving end or trying to support a survivor is that survivors are the GPS in which we take our direction from. Right. And that is so, so, so critical. And so whatever, survivors want to do or don't want to do, however they need our support, that's how we show up. And it's literally as simple as that. And it means so much because that is giving them control back. It's giving them, it's helping to empower them little by little. And those things are really, really important. But, we want folks to know that they are not alone, that what happened to them is not their fault, that there is support out there. And that, for them to tell their story, it is a privilege to be in someone's space and they have disclosed to you, right? That says a number of things that, they trust you, you are a level of safety for them on most occasions, right? So I encourage folks who are on that receiving end to hold that close, to hold that as a sacred trust and, sacred information that should be held in the highest regard.
There's so much in what you shared. Encourage people, if something just resonated with them, if they just heard what you shared and they felt something in their body, go back, rewind, listen to this again, listen to it again, and notice what's coming up. There's
Yeah.
so much richness, and I'm grateful for that. Um, what would you have to say? This is a little bit of a jump, but what would you have to say to organizations that are really interested in supporting survivors, sexual violence survivors, but also intimate partner violence survivors who are their workforce?
Yeah. So you mean folks who are working with them that have experience?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's so important that agencies recognize that they have survivors in their midst, right? That they have survivors who work for them. So, it's important that agencies be very transparent about supports in place on an organizational level to support staff who may be survivors of domestic violence or sexual violence or intimate partner violence. That's so key. What happens if someone needs additional supports? So perhaps that's just refreshing people's memory on the policies in place. Perhaps it's creating a separate sexual and domestic violence IPV policy, right? If someone comes to you and says that they have just been sexually assaulted, what does that look like on an HR level? Time off, mental health supports, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are so, so important. And also, if they are the victims of stalking or, domestic violence, there's a level of safety within all of this. And so I think it's so important that organizations think about this from a humanistic standpoint. And I say that because, as leaders and HR folks, we're all about, okay, what's in the law and, what do I have to do, right? But when you're dealing with issues of this magnitude and issues that are this sensitive and delicate, sometimes you have to think outside the box. Sometimes you have to, lead with your heart and really think about, not saying folks aren't, but really think about this from a human standpoint, right? So, I think, I'm a trained social worker. And so, how I lead looks very differently because I am a social worker, and so I tend to, my board teases me that I'm really, really nice, right? And so I think grace and compassion comes to mind when I think about organizations and how they should show up for their staff who have experienced this. You got to have grace, you got to have compassion, you got to have flexibility, right? Thinking outside of the box. There is a lot of power that we hold as leaders of our organizations. There's a lot that we can do, more so than what we can't do. And so, when I say the impact of being sexually violated, there are no words, right? And so if your staff member is coming to you, then, my hope is that you would do everything within your power so that they aren't fighting another battle with trying to make sure they can keep their job.
Yes.
Yeah.
I see the workplace and how workplace responds, particularly to sexual violence, to intimate partner,
Yeah.
as a real area of opportunity. It's a place where potentially the survivor may feel a sense of safety during the day. There's a tremendous opportunity to support. So it's really, really interesting to feel that. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, I think what the Me Too era should be teaching us, not era because it's not going anywhere, is that we need to really revisit how organizations are showing up for survivors who are their staff, right? And a lot of organizations don't have policies in place. right? And don't even think about that they have survivors in their mix, right? The data tells us 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, 1 in 10 children, right? So if you're leading an organization of like 200 people, like do the math, that's a lot of survivors, right? I am always operating on the assumption that I am standing before survivors, right? Because that's what the data tells me.
Yeah, I want to recognize too the last question I have for you, if I can keep you for a little longer,
Mhm.
is to ask about how technology is impacting sexual violence and how we see sexual violence.
Yeah, technology is such a double-edged sword, right? It can be good, it can be bad. We definitely need it on multiple levels, but it is having a huge impact. And I say a huge impact on multiple levels. So what we're seeing with our young people who have been sexually violated, who are in schools, is that they are, and we particularly saw this when they came back from virtual learning, is that we saw, particularly in DC, we saw an increase in sexual assaults happening in school, student to student on campuses. And what we saw as it relates to technology is that the girls who were violated would go on Facebook and Instagram and call out the perpetrators who sexually violated them, right? And then it would be like this division, right? Her friends would rally around her, et cetera, et cetera. So the sexual assaults were spilling over into social media, and it was very challenging territory for schools to maneuver, right? And dealing with Title IX and all of those things. So that's on one level. It's definitely impacting our youth in a not so great way. The other side to that is that we're seeing a lot of disclosures on social media, right? Folks are using that platform to bring their voice back. And, we are always in support of that. And I think as a result of what happened at the height of the Me Too movement, which was founded by Tarana Burke, a Black woman, Alyssa Milano, she tweeted like Me Too, and then, folks got educated around what actually the Me Too movement was. But, that started on social media. And so we've seen a lot of disclosures and survivors using their voice on social media. And the beauty of that in and of itself is that when a survivor can bear witness to another survivor telling their story, there is power in that. There is strength in that. That may give them the courage to tell their story. Right. So, we've seen it both ways, right? We've seen it both ways. We've seen how social media can give survivors their voice back. We've seen how social media can be used to create national discourse and conversation around sexual violence in general, right? We saw this pointedly with, Weinstein and Bill Cosby, the, Lifetime TV, they did a whole R. Kelly series, and there was so much controversy around that, right? So again, it can be used for good, but what we're also seeing is that this is challenging the tech companies to really get their act together, right? So TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, right? What are the safety measures that are being put in place where, we're looking at online abuse, we're looking at, folks who are stalking, folks who are, predatoring on children, et cetera, right? So there is a safety side as it relates to our technology folks that really needs to be tightened up, right? And I know some tech companies have really started to work with, safety advisory boards on really, getting guidance on what this looks like. There are full positions around, gender-based violence in certain tech companies, et cetera, et cetera. But, it's, there's still some work to be done.
think there's a lot to be done in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really good to think about and to consider the digital aspect of
Mhm.
stalking as well, the digital aspect of the potential for these spaces to become abusive
Yeah.
and dangerous. Yeah, and of course, so much hope. I know when I started to see survivors sharing their stories online, it certainly impacted me. That kind of courage is palpable and it really does spread. It's contagious. So just
Absolutely.
absolutely. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we close?
Yeah, this has just been such a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for just, your support of me and my leadership and just the work of the center. I think this is such a, unique time to be doing sexual violence work. There is not a walk of life that sexual violence does not impact. Everybody should be talking about sexual violence. And so I am just grateful that I get to lead one of the best organizations in the game and the Otis Rape Crisis Center. And I think, for me, my work is really continuing to just be in service, right? I think in order to really disrupt sexual violence on the level that it needs to be disrupted, is that it's going to take partners, right? It's going to take a coalition, a global coalition to really make that happen. And so I'm just grateful that you have been and continue to be a part of our journey. And anyone out there, definitely reach out for support and just know that you aren't alone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Indira Henard.